slaves at the Cape of Good Hope in the 17th and 18th century. Now, recently there's been some writings by historians in Cape Town, and one person who's now in the Netherlands. And that's one of the reasons why I chose the opening gambit of freedom imposed, because as you'll see later, there's other titles have been used in other academic papers talking about restricted freedom and qualified freedom and absolute freedom. So I wanted to deconstruct the idea of freedom and also what does it really mean. But to start, I want to talk about two key but seemingly disparate incidents that happened at the Cape. And I will then proceed from there to illustrate the freedom that was imposed on them. So on the 2nd of February, 1730, Christiaan Wynandsz and Jacobus Hendriksz stand security for Christiaan Liebenberg. And the Council of Policy approves Liebenberg's request to slaughter sheep and oxen for inhabitants, for the colony's inhabitants. So this was not to supply the return fleet or the inbound or outbound fleets, but this was to feed the colony too. Very, very important. But what intrigued me about this is that Christiaan Liebenberg is actually my ancestor. And I think he's a 7th great-grandfather on my father's side through the Basson family. And he gets sponsored by two men with ostensible Dutch names and Dutch patronymics, Christiaan Wynandsz and Jacobus Hendriksz. But actually, these two guys are free blacks, and they both hail from Bengal, which is present-day Bangladesh and Western Bengal currently within India itself. So, first question, why would these two free blacks sponsor a recently arrived European immigrant? And of course, secondly, in the meat business. Now, it's taken me many years to understand and appreciate South Africans and their love of meat. And every time I go back home, I'm always amazed to see all the biltong everywhere, how ubiquitous it is. And everyone's munching and chewing on biltong. And it's no surprise when you think about how so much of the industry at the Cape was focused on supplying these VOC fleets. And it must have entailed huge butchering of animals. And everyone could make money out of it. And that's really that's all the colony was really doing, other than the rest of, providing support for other aspects for the return fleet, and then with the expansion of the colony. So, yeah, there you have it. You've got Christiaan Wynandsz and Jacobus Hendriksz both involved in the butcher business. So it's interesting because if you read the resolution in which it was approved by the Council of Policy, you'll see that I have another ancestor, a Cape-born ancestor, Jonas van der Poel, who is also involved in the beestenvlees, right, in the schapen als beestenvlees. And they are also given permission to slaughter and to sell livestock. But the other two burgers, besides Jonas van der Poel, there's also Ernst Friedrich de Swart. Now, he intrigued me because he actually ended up owning Koenradenberg, which is at Hopefield, the famous opstal, Cape Dutch opstal. And we also know that Koenradenberg was actually granted originally to Birgit Pieters van Dijk, who was possibly Norwegian, and whose brother also came out, and they were lumbermen, lumberjacks, and they had speciality in timber, but they clearly soon joined the meat business, like everyone else. And if you look at the position of Koenradenberg, it's at Hopefield, and Hopefield's right on the perimeter or almost inside, of the so-called Slagtersveld. So the company, the VOC, reserved the whole of the west coast up to Darling and higher to Saldanha for grazing, and exclusively kept the ground, the land for grazing of the livestock. So a lot of prominent Cape burghers then, repositioned themselves around the Slagtersveld to also participate in this activity. So yeah, there's the shambles. Meat, meat, meat. This is what we do best. I think South Africans don't realize the quality of the meat compared to other places in the world. I think the only rivals we have are the Uruguayans and the Argentinians when it comes to that. Anyway, so that's the one incident, the standing as guarantors for a newly arrived Cape Free burger, who was, of course, Christiaan Liebenberg. Liebenberg is interesting too because he marries into the Libber family, and the Libber family, of course, have Van Heiningen connections, which go back to the VOC in Batavia and are one of the more prominent VOC official families. So Jacoba Brandenburg, who was the stammoeder of the Libbers, she came out with one of the Van Heiningens, who was her uncle. So clearly there's a network going on there. And then the next incident, more interesting. In 1736, Christiaan Wynandsz, Vrijswart, purchases a clavichord, which was then standing in the solder at Welgelegen, which is the farm at Mowbray where the famous Mosterd's mill has recently been renovated again. And he buys from the deceased estate of Barbara de Jong, who was from Utrecht, and she was also an ancestor of mine. And Barbara de Jong was very wealthy, and she has a very interesting estate that she leaves with, her possessions of, and of course there was also a harpsichord as well that was bought by another free burger. But of course, the question here is, why did this free black buy this musical instrument? If you look at the inventories of the Cape, the ones that have survived, there are very few musical instruments, and very few books, and very few portraits. But those that had them, of course, were clearly more wealthy than the rest of the population, or the colonial population. But one wonders whether Christiaan Wynandsz, this was a triumphant moment in his life where, if I take that, I'm now rich and I'm ensconced as a free burger, just like the rest of you guys, and I'm going to wallow in my wealth and I'm going to show it off, And of course, he may well have had a musical background because the slaves were often used as performers at special functions by the governor and by the ruling elite. Governor Bucks was particularly proud of his orchestra of slaves. And of course, the clavichord, I mean, there's not many that are on record at being at the Cape, although we do know that Maria van Riebeeck, Maria de la Caillerie, she of course had one of them with her when she arrived. And we know this because she played for the French clergy that were stranded at the Cape after their ship went was damaged coming via Madagascar. So yes, here you have the second incident, this musical instrument, which clearly fascinates me. There's Vrygeven, a moot point. I learned a little bit about harpsichords and clavichords, and also, the clave cymbal, right, is what he buys, which is, and then at also intriguing, the instrument was in the solder. So, I'm not sure if this is the attic or the loft, because I didn't realize that attic and loft are actually quite different. It may well have been a loft if they were still performing, old Mrs. Johanna de Jong, and also maybe it was already, collecting dust and just stored. So there was Christiaan Wynandsz, which I must mention, he appears often in the vendu roles, buying from deceased estates. So I think this is one way that he also made money. So he does seem to demonstrate a kind of business acumen. So yeah, and also Barbara de Jong is, what's interesting is, why did he use the patronym Wynandsz? Clearly it wasn't his father, but Wynandsz is a name that is particularly associated with the Besatenheid family, and they of course were part of Vrygeven, and they were very wealthy, the Besatenheids. They also, one member marries a Wessels, who of course was a butcher, and of course Wessels is from Hamburg, also German, but his daughter of course marries Simon van der Stel's second son, Jonker Franciscus, or Don Francisco, who was the brother of Willem Adriaan, who was also subsequently removed from the Cape after the Adam Tuss Henning Huysen rebellion. Another intriguing point, Simon, the father, stays behind on Constantia, but the two sons have to return to the Netherlands. And of course, Franciscus van der Stel, Frans van der Stel, Jonker as he was known, he didn't quite lose all his property because his wife was Cape born, and she remained behind at the Cape to finalize the estate and to tie up things and eventually repatriate. So there you had a Kaapse that goes back to the Netherlands, and strictly speaking doesn't repatriate because she was born at the Cape. Okay, so here I would, so the point here is Christiaan Wynandsz and Jacobus Hendriksz are what I call Kaapse verkleermannetjies. They're chameleons, because most researchers have overlooked them, missed them, not realized who they really were, because on the face of it they just look like another Dutch couple. Oh, and I wanted to mention too, the Botmas and the Besatenheids were connected, of course, to Vrygeven, but Johanna Barbara de Jong's second husband was Christiaan Passman. Passman, he was a builder and a constructor. And what's interesting is that later we'll see that Jacobus Hendriksz was also supplying lime to various people, including the Burgerwachthuis. So these guys were, not just into butchery, they were also into construction, and maybe buying and selling too, I suppose, smosing. And maybe the musical instrument was just bought as an investment, or maybe just because it was a sign of prestige, of newly acquired wealth. Open question, of course. So yes, these two guys are not the only two verkleermannetjies. There was Robert Schott, who's from Bengal, Jan Jacobus, who was, of course, Cape-born, and interesting, half Angolan, half Makassarese. And then Willem Thomas, he was also an imported slave. Titus Jacobus, imported. He was from Makassar. Karel Jans from Bengal. And, of course, the Cape-born class, Wynandsz, who was Armazine class's son, whose father was Indian and whose mother, of course, would have descended from Lespit Arabus. No, sorry, her sister Cornelia Arabus, who was the Abyssinian slave abducted by the French on Madagascar. So, and then finally Hercules Valentine. And for those out there, if you got any Costa or Coetzee connections, they marry into the Coetzee family, which is a well-known West Coast and family, and very, very prestigious family, because they also clearly show connections to a past in Europe that was, that they were connected to nobility. Okay, so then I wanted to just quickly mention that in this talk, I'm not going to be talking about enslaved and enslaver. I'm not going to buy into that absolute nonsense of trying to be politically correct or woke. And the reason why I do this is that not all slaves were enslaved. Some slaves, many in fact, were born into slavery. And this distinction becomes very, very important as a status determinant in the colony. And it had a lot to do with your right to freedom if you were Halfslag or Cape-born, first or second generation. These distinctions mattered at the time. They might not matter now, but that's no reason to then conflate these categories and just conveniently use a new blanket term, which has no historical points of reference, and call them enslaved. Okay, so but very important that anyone who's researching slavery at the Cape should be sensitive to the different categories. And the same goes for Halfslag and Heelslag and Castis. These are not fully appreciated, I find, even after 30 years of trying to, explain it in more detail. It's very, very important because Halfslag slaves had a right to freedom, automatic in the sense of enriching legal majority. And at that time, it females 22 and males 25. So, and Heelslag slaves didn't have a hope in hell of automatic freedom. They would have to serve 40 years plus and then, buy their freedom and also prove that they could speak Dutch and that they were Christians and baptized. Now, once again, it becomes complicated because the private slaves were not necessarily baptized. And the company slaves were eventually all baptized by the company and the church. So once again, these distinctions become very important. What happens if you're a private slave? What happens if you're a company slave? What happens if you're Heelslag? What happens if you're Halfslag? And of course, the other problem too is that there was actually a legal prohibition on Heelslag slaves marrying Europeans. So there was a kind of a Mixed Marriages Act, a proto-Mixed Marriages Act, even at that time. Halfslag, no problem, because they were assimilated partially and they, were more conversant in Dutch and they were more likely to be baptized. So the problem for the Dutch at that time was, allowing non-baptized Heelslag slaves. All right, so I was talking about Halfslag, Heelslag, Vrijgeven, and Vrygeborene.
I think we've missed a Vrygeven and a Vrygeborene.
Okay, Vrijgeven was, people that were manumitted. They were formally freed, and as opposed to people who were born in freedom, who were born free, right, and were never ever enslaved. So their enslaved would be an appropriate usage. So this is important because I think people don't always get the manumission part. Manus is hand in Latin, and it meant, mittere is to send, or to send by hand, literally. So when you manumitted a slave, you were freeing them by releasing them from your hold, your leefeiken. So, these terms make logical sense when you deconstruct them. And but also, more importantly, during the VOC period at the Cape, slaves were manumitted, which meant that they were real property in the legal sense of real. They were a real right, real as in re as in republica, which means the people's goods, the people's property. Re is property. And all landed property, as well as slave property, had to be registered. So the point here is the control was exercised by the company or by the crown or the state. It was not, you were not at liberty to sommer free people at whim or at will. There were certain bureaucratic, regulations that, so just like landed property, if it's not registered, you can't prove ownership. And there had to be a deed of ownership for slaves as well as for land. So, you've got the encroachment of higher authorities that are controlling things. So there's a tendency in some slave literature to talk about, slave owners being able to do as they please and just free left, right, and center. It didn't work that way. Also very, very important. And that's why the term manumit and manumission should be used. It's not just giving someone their freedom. And recently I was reading a newly published article where they spoke about absolute freedom. And I mean, it's nonsense. There's no such thing as absolute freedom. Not in the Western legal sense. Land was owned by the company and then granted to people individually. So that's another aspect about Cape land ownership, is that the company basically retained its right of all ownership. So people with their land claims and their expropriation stuff, they need to go back to the basics. And if they want to get compensation, they need to maybe get it from the VOC, which is, was the legal heirs of the VOC is the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So, go there and ask them for compensation, because they appropriated the land and they dished it out again. And it was conditional. It was never full ownership. It became full ownership eventually with the evolution of time. So yeah, very complicated, but interesting, I think. And it's good to know if you are researching deeds, slave deeds and land deeds. All right, so conditional liberation. This raises another question. If a slave was property, so you could alienate your property freely, subject to constraints, but generally it was you had a real right and you could alienate, sell, cede, transfer your property. You could get credit on your property. You could use it for security. So yes, slaves could be transferred from one owner to another. Now, of course, we don't do that nowadays, and we don't, but we have to acknowledge that that was the way then, and that's what people did. They sold people, and they owned people, and they acquired people, and they hired people, and they seeded them, and they raised money on them. And even the slaves themselves were, in a position to accumulate some wealth by their own labor if they were hired out by their owners. And that's also important to, because you have to ask yourself, how did Jacobus, Hendriksz, and how did Christiaan Wynandsz acquire their wealth? Were they supported by other people? Were they financed by richer people? were they able to do this just by themselves, which seems very unlikely? And their success ultimately, how did that come to be? So next question, if you could free your slave, manumit your slave, could you make it conditional? Yes, you could, because it was your property. So you could put down certain conditions, like, this is my slave, I'm going back to Europe, but if should I come back to the Cape and go east, then I want to, have my slave back. So, that was a conditional freedom. They could have also, been transferred to other people and saying, you can use my slave for 3 years, and then you must free him, and I will sell you the slave too, but the slave must be manumitted after 3 years. So you could come up with all kinds of creative conditions. But, most people are not creative at the best of times. So there aren't that many cases of interesting conditional freedoms. There are obviously examples in the records, but generally people just free their slaves and let go of them. But this is my topic today, and that is the residual bonds. Like, could you really dispense completely with your slave, or are they forever connected to you or tied to you in some way by legal bonds or even moral bonds or convention? So this is something I wanted people to think about. And then, of course, the next question is, if you gave your slave freedom, could you take it back and put them back in slavery? Technically, theoretically, yes, you could do that. You could reverse the manumission. You could nullify it. But we only know of one case at the Cape of one slave who behaved so badly that his former owner had him put back into slavery. But note, with the help of the authorities, he didn't do this by himself. That's crucial. And then I'm just reminded, when I was at the end of my university studies, South Africa watched that horrible movie called Mississippi Burning, 1988. And I remember being so horrified by this movie, because what we saw as South Africans, and this was, 1988, what we saw was, in the movie, these slaves, American slaves in the South, are in church, and then you see the Ku Klux Klan come in and burn the church, and then the lynching. And I remember walking out of the cinema quite disgusted and deeply, deeply shocked, because that was not the South African experience. And in terms of Roman Dutch law, there is such a thing, a concept as natural justice. If you give somebody rights and privileges, you cannot really take them back. You can, but if you do, it's just immoral. There's no way that you give somebody their freedom and then say, sorry, you're no longer free. You're back in slavery. So, the dictates of natural justice are that once privileges and freedoms are granted, they can never be nullified. Well, they shouldn't. And we had the same situation even with the same-sex marriages in the United States, because when the Supreme Court hadn't yet made its final ruling, some states were legitimizing same-sex marriage and other states were unwilling to do so. And in some cases, in some states where same-sex marriages were actually legalized, they had to then be nullified. And this is not the South African way. And, this also ties up with expropriation without compensation. There's no such thing as expropriation where there's no compensation. There's always been compensation for expropriation. That's natural justice. And this is a new way of trying to steal the land and to hijack the land ownership position. So, it's also worth thinking about in terms of reversing rights that have been granted, and what does that really mean? And is it possible for that to happen? So, as I said, yes, There were two cases at the early Cape. Louis van Bengala was so unhappy with his recalcitrant concubine, Lisbeth Saunders, that he asked the authorities to put her back in slavery, and they looked the other way. They weren't going to go there because it was asking too much. So even there, the Council of Justice and the Council of Policy were not willing to grant his wish. And then, of course, there's the case of Manuel van Angola and Antoni van Angola, who were business partners at Jacobus in Stellenbosch. They had an issue because their slave, Simon Ham, who was a Malagasy slave, had been accidentally shot, and they wanted compensation for his death. And the owner, their former owner, who was Jan Holschmidt, who was actually the second husband of the very famous widow Mostert, Hester van Lier. And he threatened, as former owner, to put them back in slavery, but not to the authorities, to them alone. And of course, they laughed at him and, continued with pursuing their case, and nothing came of it. So, yeah, there was, as I say, there was only one incident where one slave was actually put back into slavery. But it would have been considered pretty indecent to free a slave and then put them back in slavery, especially if there was no real grounds for doing so. Okay. So just briefly, I've got 2 paragraphs on manumission. Manumission, pro forma blanket liberation of a slave requiring centralized registration, but which could also be conditional, with slave ownership also being a real or absolute right akin to landed property, and also requiring VOC authorization, same as landed property rights. So registration. And it's interesting, South Africa had a centralized land registration and slave system already from Van Riebeeck's time. I think in England, central registration only happened in the Victorian period. It's quite interesting to compare. And then the second point about manumission, it could be both conditional. A slave could be freed on certain conditions. So Hester Mostert, she freed Manuel van Angola and Lisbeth, and she made the condition that they should serve her whenever she needed them, but they could be free. So she kept some kind of residual hold over them. And of course, Jacob Kau, he was a famous VOC official. He returned east and he left a slave at the Cape, and then he made provision for her to go back with them as a slave. So she had a brief period of freedom at the Cape, but probably in the care of one of the other VOC officials, who kept a watchful eye over her, no doubt. So yes, and manumission was also regulated by statute. This is very important. The statutes of Batavia, it was the codified law of the VOC at Batavia, and of course the Cape was basically a colony of Batavia. And we fell technically under Asia, not so the start of the VOC, their charter was granted by the States General, and it starts at Cape Town and it continues to Timor. So we were technically Asian, and we were a colony of Batavia, and under the Governor General, under his authority, and the Council of Batavia. So the statute regulated the manumission and the registration of the deeds, and how many witnesses should be, how many witnesses are needed to make it legal and valid, etc., etc. And then, of course, there was also inheritance conditions and church regulations. So this is also intriguing because the church had issues with freedom and also with slavery, and they had to unpack the whole problem of, do you baptize slaves? Do they have a right to baptism? Can they refuse baptism? If they have baptism, what do they get out of it? You know, is it a launching pad for later freedom? So, and then even more importantly, if you were baptized and you were a slave, private or company owned, you could not be resold. So once again, an impediment, a legal impediment that said baptized slaves cannot be sold again. And there were also inheritance conditions in the Statute of Batavia. If you later on, not in the early period, the very early period, later on, if you were a freed slave and you died without heirs, then your previous owner would automatically inherit all your property. And then, of course, there was also another regulation in the Statutes of Batavia that said you had to give 1/4 of your estate to your previous owner. Now that for me was very disturbing. I only happened on that not so long ago when I was transcribing the joint will of Titus Jacobus and his wife Johanna van Ambon. Now this couple are very interesting because they belonged to Hendriksz, who was one of the officials, and in their wills, and the joint will, and then of course the widow's will after his death, they make provision for their previous owners' sons to inherit 1/4 of their estate. And they were wealthy. They were also very wealthy, which begs the question again, how did they become so wealthy? Okay, so again, you know, you can compare other legal aspects like legitimate portion. Many people are unaware that in Roman Dutch law, we didn't have primogeniture. Every descendant of the deceased, male in the male or the female line, and legitimate or illegitimate, had full right to inherit from the parent, the mother or the father. So they had an inherent right to a legitimate portion of the estate. This was done away with by the British once they colonized us. And the law of inheritance was changed somewhat. So once again, that also raises the question of how Roman Dutch is our legal system. It's still very Roman Dutch, but of course there have been inroads made by the British, especially in law, in terms of law of evidence and commercial law, mercantile law, and constitutional law. So it's a kind of a half and half now, I suppose. It would be wrong to say that our legal system is purely Roman Dutch. It's not true. It's a hybrid legal system and very complex. Okay, so this now, I think you should be realizing that people like Christiaan Wynandsz and Jacobus Hendriksz, and even old Titus Jacobus, these people were a select few that were freed. They were imported slaves, not born at the Cape, but clearly, when we look at their biodata, we'll see that they arrived as youngsters. And they would be, as I say, a select few. Most of these people were slaves in the households of company officials and rich Cape burghers. It was not your run-of-the-mill Cape burgher who sometimes didn't even own slaves. It was the super ruling rich of the Cape colony that were freeing these people and attaching them after manumission to their extended household. And another point I want to mention is that, you know, there's the old Roman law concept of pater familias, mater familias. The pater familias was like the stamfather, and he was the the head of the family, and his family not only included his own children, but his extended family as well as his slaves. And they were considered part and parcel of the family. And this is very important because when you look at the trial papers of Hendriksz murder, that was the stammoeder of the Visser family. When you look at those trial papers, it's so interesting because there's constant mention of how this slave, by killing his patronesse, was, violating all the natural order of the time, because she owned him, she looked after him, she cared for him, ostensibly, theoretically, technically, and he was bound to her also in terms of loyalty. So, killing your mother was tantamount to matricide. So in effect, that's what he gets executed for in the end, because he had killed his mother. And you have the other slave in the household at the time that she's being axed to death by her slave, screaming, "Moederes dood, moederes dood." And the confirmation that she, as a slave, referred to her owner, her patronesse, as mother, moeder. So, yeah, the bonds are strong. And nowadays we want to see slaves as victims of history and as people that have been denied their freedom. But it's more complicated than that. It's so much more complicated than that. And this is where it becomes interesting, because if we're going to highlight the success of people like Christiaan Wynandsz and Jacobus Hendriksz, then we have to keep in mind that these were privileged slaves or ex-slaves who had and it turns out that some of them were so wealthy and they were so tied to their former owners and patrons that they became a new elite in their own right. And one wonders to what extent they were not necessarily liked by other people, especially other slaves, and even the poorer freeburgers who were not really owning any slaves and didn't have the same rights to credit, the same rights to money, the same rights and privileges that were being accorded to them by their ex-masters. And the term patron and patronesse also gets used interchangeably with owner, right, and master. And so this also for me was very interesting, because patron nowadays is a positive word. We normally see a patron of the arts, someone who supports the arts, like the Oppenheimer family at Little Brenthurst. They are, or the Ruperts, they buy artwork and they promote artists, and so they become major patrons in society, and somehow that makes up for their amassed wealth, which is quite obscene, maybe from the perspective of people who have little, right? So, it's a kind of I suppose, a PR thing to do if you are wealthy, because, anyone who has a lot of money will know that most people are doing their utmost to part you from your money. So being rich is not always comfortable, because there's always going to be people around you, and there'll be scavengers, and there'll be lickspittles, people who are trying to ingratiate themselves, to latch on to these rich people and to benefit from that relationship. So that's interesting too, right? So let's just bear in mind that Christiaan Wynandsz and Jacobus Hendriksz, my question here is, let's look at their biodata. Let's dig deeper and let's see how they came to, what happened, what transpired in their lifetime. So Christiaan Wynandsz, the name Wynand, as I said, alludes to the Besadenhout and the family. The Besadenhouts are and the Botmas are two very old Dutch families at the Cape who have really left their mark. The Besadenhouts are, they eventually interface with the Khoi, they become, at the Slachters Neck Rebellion, they go native. And then the Botmas that stay at the Cape, they, become elite and patrician and extremely wealthy. But very representative family, and it spans all the different communities of South Africa, colored and English and Afrikaans speaking South Africans. So yeah, he's also the owner of the farm Goeie Hoop, which is one of the earliest grants at the Cape of land. This is very curious. But what's also curious is that anyone who studies land ownership at the Cape will also realize that it's very exceptional for property, landed property, to remain in the hands of the same family or for more than one or two generations. It's unique almost. We have situations like the Myburghs at Fora owning, Meerlust for many generations, but that was very exceptional. And the reason for that is also because the Roman Dutch legal system meant that the whole property had to be subdivided and paid out to the descendants after all debts were paid. So you'll see with the inventories, all the slaves are sold, all the immovable property, all the movable property, and the slaves get resold or retained by the family if they were able to buy them back. So it was a much more fluid system than the British system, which was really based on, you could appoint your universal heir and you could restrict it to the eldest son only. You had much more freedom to distribute your property before you die. Whereas at the Cape, that didn't quite work. They were a lot more family-based, and everyone could inherit equally. So this is also explains why land ownership changes hands almost every generation. So yeah, he owns Goeie Hoop for a short while, but fascinating, a free black owning one of the oldest farms at the Cape. And of course, he buys one of the Van Dyke brothers, one of their houses, which he sets up, and he is also granted another house. So you can see his property acquisition is materializing. And who did he originally belong to? Now, this is the thing that people who have now, academics who have written about Christiaan Wynandsz and about Jacobus Hendriksz, they haven't pursued the research further to, identifying how they came to the Cape and who they actually belonged to. And as I said, they could have had more than one owner. In the case of Christiaan Wynandsz, I think it's very clear that he was he was brought to the Cape and sold to the stamfather of the De Beers, Dirxz De Beer, who was one of the richest Free Cape burghers, and of course, who was interrelated by marriage with the Verburg family. And the Verburg family are truly fascinating because they have Japanese connections too, not just in terms of having served at Nagasaki, but also intermarried with Japanese women. And the Verburgs were patrician, mostly top-ranking VOC officials. So old De Beer, he buys on the 4th of February 1687 from the first mate of the Kranenburg, the ship, the Heelslag Kranenburg, and he sold for $30 to Dirxz De Beer, the Cape freeburger. So we know on what ship he came out, and we know who sold him. So this is what was happening with the return fleet. Those that were able to bring some slaves to the Cape, they were able to dispose of them because there was a ban on taking slaves back to Europe. So you either had to sell them or have them returned to Batavia. So, some of these ship's crew, more higher ranking people, like the skippers and the first mates and the admiral, they would make some money on the side by selling slaves en route, or en passant when they're on their way back to Europe. So this is what happened in the case of Christiaan. Of course, Jan Dirxz, where would Christiaan Wynandsz have flourished? Jan Dirxz De Beer owned Veldhuizen. He was a miller, he was a burger councillor, he owned Ecklenburg, which was really granted to old Jacob Klutti, and he owned Boschhevel, which once belonged to Van Riebeeck. Very prize farms. And of course, here's the owner's family. So there were 8 children. Notably, one son was given the name Africanus as a second name to show that the family saw themselves maybe as African now. And then he sold again together with another slave, Corridon, and he sold to Peter Jourdan, or Pierre Jourdan, who was one of the Jourdan French Huguenot refugees that were shipped out to the Cape from 1688 onwards. And this is where it becomes problematic, because the evidence is not as clear. But Pierre Jourdan had an adulterous wife, and it's interesting that the man that she was shacking up with as a married woman is never named. But I'm certain, almost certain, that this was, of course, the Volksluisnaamvader. He was the chief, the boss, timmerman of the company, and he started, and he was also a very interesting man, because he kept a whole bevy of slave women that he was impregnating, at least 4 or 5 women that had children by him. And he never marries, but he does, and he never acknowledges his offspring legally in his will. He actually avoids any responsibility. But in his lifetime, he does support them, and he does live with them, which is very curious. Anyway, so Pierre Jourdan's wife, she was a Noy Unius, a family that was connected to the sick comforters and the church and had salon connections. She was banished to Batavia and put in the tuchthuis for her misdemeanors. So I suspect it's at this point that that Christiaan Wynandsz is alienated legally, or sold, or even freed. But there's no record. We don't have a record for this. But his former mistress ends up in the spinning house, the spinhuis, or the house of correction, the tuchthuis in Batavia. There's a picture. And it gets even more intriguing, because her daughter marries the Raja of Tambora's son, who is, of course, Indonesian royalty, and who becomes baptized and converts to Christianity. And he changes his name from Muhammad Dayan to David Sultania. And they get to go back to Batavia, the family. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that, because there's quite a few things that happen that, make life at the Cape intolerable for them. Anyway, then we get to his baptism, Christiaan's baptism. He gets baptized, and it's stated, so he's not freed yet. So yes, let me correct myself here. He's not freed yet, because he is baptized as the slave of Andries Cornelissen, or Anders, because he was van Tönne, and that was part of Denmark at that time. So more intriguing are the witnesses, Dina van Koilang and Jan Loy, or Jan Liu van Ceylon. Now, this couple were married after their freedom, their manumission, and they belonged to Hester Mostert. And this is intriguing too, because he becomes one of the first freeburgers at Stellenbosch. And we now see that Christiaan Wynandsz also has Stellenbosch connections, and with a very important family, the Mosterts. And Mostert was a miller as De Beer. So connections. All right. So very quickly, Christiaan marries 3 times. But even more intriguing, no issue, no children. And this is the same for Jacobus Hendriksz, as we can see later. Jacobus Hendriksz also dies childless, but they both lived to their 80s almost, if not older. And they both die very rich men, and they die as significant members of the colony's inhabitants. They are almost like pillars of the society because they are given military roles. They play an important role in civic matters. And intriguing too is that they both free their slaves, many slaves, and have them baptized. Now, this is something which has always amazed me because I have other ancestors like Angela, old Mrs. Basson or Moeder Jacht. She never freed a single slave, and she lived to a ripe old age. She was, she was very protective of her property and perhaps for her family, who knows, but she certainly didn't feel the need to ever free any of her slaves. And this is very different to the behavior of Christiaan Wynandsz and, of course, Jacobus Hendriksz. So, okay, I'm going to scroll down. You will see that he baptizes slaves, tweeslawenkinderen, tweelingen. He marries secondly Rachel Jacobs van Makassar. His first wife, Susanna Antonia van Batavia, having passed away. And he baptizes a slave in 1720. He's appointed the sergeant of Vrykorps, which was a special military unit that was created for freed slaves and slaves that were born illegitimate. Now, this is another important point because illegitimacy plays a very important role in status at the Cape. And I would go so far as to say that it trumps equality or equality. Even if you were given your freedom, you were still contaminated by your slave past if it was connected to illegitimacy. And this is another problem with terminology because nowadays we are being told not to use the word bastard or illegitimate and that all people are legitimate. Now, this is also nonsense because it wasn't like that in the 17th century. And bastardy determined the outcome of your life. You were, in a sense, it was akin to the caste system in India. You just could never rid yourself of it if you were born a bastard. And the Roman Dutch law is so interesting because it makes provision for some bastards to be legitimized. And, I don't know if you know about the famous Cape ceremony, but Colin Graham Water writes about it. The illegitimate children were legitimized when the parents or the adoptive father and their mother present themselves at church to be married, and the children are hidden under her petticoats, and they are allowed to, they are revealed once the ties of marriage are cemented. And it's a very symbolic moment where these kids walk out from their mother, from under her dress, and they become legitimized. But there were problems with this too, because you could not be legitimized if you were born out of adultery. Because normally you could have voorkinders, like Angela of Bengal. She had 4 voorkinderen, 4 illegitimate children by 2 different fathers. And they were legitimized when she married Arnoldus Willems Basson. So being born out of wedlock wasn't such a problem because there was always the possibility of legitimization, but not in all cases. So once again, problematic. Okay, so back to Christiaan Wynandsz. He emancipates 4 slaves in 1726. He marries for the 3rd time Armasina Jonas. daughter of Klaas Jonas and Dina van Pima, and granddaughter of the company Heelslag Armezien Klaas. And of course, that would be great-granddaughter of Cornelia Arabus from Abyssinia, from the very, very interesting connections here. And he's also marrying, marriage in we often, we are now so brainwashed by modern the romantic sense of marriage, that you are free to marry the person you love. And of course, this is this is how we think. We don't see it as arranged or contractual, but a lot of marriages are based on wealth accumulation and family connections. And if you don't have the approval of the in-laws, you've got problems, in having the marriage accepted by the community. And hence the bans and, the control by the church and the state of the institution of marriage. And this is another key factor because, we forget, this surprised me with the same-sex marriages when that became like a global phenomenon. No one was talking about the role of the state in controlling or recognizing your marriage. Because marriage is a contract. You don't need the state to acknowledge or to recognize your union. And of course, before the Reformation, it was the church that had the monopoly on controlling the institution of marriage. So, yeah, I think for me, I don't want the state or the church I don't want their recognition if I get married. Why? So we have the remnants of state or church control that are still very much alive and well and living in South Africa, right? So think about it, in terms of these institutions and the constraints that they have imposed on us. Imposed freedom. Okay, so he marries Armsina. It seems to be a marriage of convenience. What is very interesting is that he, Christiaan, after 3 marriages, has no children. And Jacobus, Hendriksz, only marries once, but he also has no children. I'm a little concerned about that because we know, they both come from the Coromandel Coast, and we know they come from a very complex Asian society, where the caste system is so deeply embedded. And of course, you had the interaction between Hindu, the Gentives, the Jintu, which is the origin of the word Jintu at the Cape, heathens, as the Dutch would have called them because they were not Christian, and the Muslims, who were people of the book, so they were seen as a bit more acceptable because they still believed in the same God as the Christians and the Jews. But the Gentives or the Jintus were heathen, and of course they were lower down in the hierarchy. But the Muslims were known to castrate their male slaves. So I do wonder, was he a eunuch? Both these guys, were they eunuchs? Were they castrated at a very early age? And would that be the reason why they never procreated? Of course, we will never know, but an interesting thing, situation, something to ponder anyhow. Okay, so let's move to Jacobus Hendriksz. His biodata are very similar to Christiaan Wynandsz. He also comes to the Cape at a very young age. And on the Sparendam, the ship, and it departs from Ceylon, which does indicate a strong Muslim, side. The Tamils, they are one of the groups that, that dominated the island, and of course the original Sinhalese were Hindu, right? So yeah, one wonders if he was enslaved by Muslims first and then sold, and sent from Ceylon and sold at the Cape, once again by a merchant sailing on the Sparendam, and who sells him to the Cape-based dominee Adrianus de Voogd. And Adrianus de Voogd, of course, is a very interesting man too, because he was a dominee at the Cape for quite some time, and he of course was temporary. He doesn't stay very long, and of course he sells Jacobus Hendriksz to his brother-in-law, so who stay on at the Cape, and the brother-in-law, of course, is Hendriksz Krudop, who later on becomes acting governor, or acting commander, more specifically. And he's also Hofmeester. He's the first president of the Orphan Chamber. He becomes second in command mostly, and he's also famous for promulgating new plakaten to control mixed unions between Europeans and non-Europeans. So he was quite a rigid man. He, and in his household, he has a seconded ex-slave who works for him. And this is, of course, Maria Hendriksz. Maria Hendriksz is one of the most fascinating people. She's the oldest mixed race slave-born child at the Cape. She's the first Halfslag, and she's born in 1655. She really is deserving of more prominence because she is the first mixed race child of the Cape. And her life is very interesting. She's also the owner of Jacobus Hendriksz, and I think he takes the name Hendriksz from her, because she was, of course, her father was Hendriksz, who eventually goes to Mauritius. And Hendriksz, of course, went into the interior together with Van As, who was Angela's lover, and with Koning, who was Angela's other lover, and with Mirov, who then got to marry Eva. So they all connected. And Maria Hendriksz is the oldest, right? So she's born in the colony in 1655. And she lives a long life, and she's a successful businesswoman. And it gets more interesting because Simon van der Stel, who is bosom buddies with her husband, who was a German from Frankfurt, Pfeiffer, Simon van der Stel dies in their house in 1712. And they were business partners, but part of the gripe with Pfeiffer and his wife was that they were slavishly Simon van der Stel supporters, and they were also accumulating wealth. They controlled the dietary requirements of the slave lodge. They controlled all the fishing at Saldanha. And even after Pfeiffer dies, her second husband, she continues alone, and then when she remarries, he continues until he gets banished from the Cape. But Maria Hendriksz is a well-connected woman, as you can see. And that means Jacobus Hendriksz is well-connected. I mean, he's got this patronesse wat skrik van niks. She's all-powerful, and she's got the seniority, of having been born at the Cape, and also her mother then becomes even more important because her mother is a slave of Van Riebeeck together with Angela. And I'm going to come to her because, these are so fascinating in terms of the connections. So the Pfeiffers, of course, they owned the famous Westerford, which is the school now in Rondebosch. That was their property, but they owned other property too. They also owned the Rudebloem, which is at Woodstock. This property also later comes into the Van Rieenen family, and becomes a very prime estate at Woodstock. So yeah, this is where Jacobus Hendriksz is, hanging out. Very, very. Okay, so just Maria Hendriksz, I don't want to go into too much detail because you can read about her on, on my blog too. And I will be writing a lot more about her in future because there's so much about her life that and the ramifications of her life that need to be explored in more detail. But Maria Hendriksz marries, secondly, Peter Bertram Ortman, and of course he's from Cologne, like her previous husband. Something intriguing about her is that she has 2 daughters by her first husband. And there's another problem with her first husband because he was banished to Robben Island, and then he becomes Simon van der Stel's, top guy, and they buddies and bankies for boeties, and of course Henning Haysing and Adam Tuss, they all end up hating Pfeiffer because he becomes so wealthy and he's so closely connected to Maria Hendriksz and to Pfeiffer himself. So Pfeiffer had a criminal record, and that didn't go down well with the new free burghers that were coming into the colony. But yeah, so she has 2 daughters by her first husband at a very late stage, I think when she's already in her 40s. And it's, this is puzzling. Like, did she have no other children between, from the time, she was able to give birth to children? I wonder if these 2 daughters were not perhaps adopted. And you have to ask yourself too, Jacobus Hendriksz doesn't leave any known progeny. So yeah, lots to still follow through and to follow up. So yeah, she has the monopoly on all the fishing at Saldanha, and she supplies food to the slave lodge. Now you must remember I spoke about the meat trade and the butchering. Meat was obviously prized for the return fleet and also for the burghers, but to make meat go as far as it could, slaves were given fish and rice, which was imported from Batavia. So it's very interesting. I mean, you've got the Cape culture that is very fish-based, the Western Cape, and then of course the rest of the country, which is meat-eating deluxe. And the fact that we eat rice, vlees, and aardappels should be something to consider too. It's like, why do we have rice? We didn't grow rice, but it was imported on such large scales that it became part of our natural diet. Very interesting. And fish, not so much, because unless you're a Kaapenaar, you're probably not really going to enjoy seafood to the same extent. So very interesting. But anyway, I'm just as an aside. Now we have the baptism of Jacobus Hendriksz gets baptized ultimately as an adult, and of course he acquires many slaves and he frees a lot of them. And what becomes intriguing about him is that his one slave marries Rosetta van Bengala. Rosetta van Bengala belonged to Rosetta van Boeghies, who of course was the wife of the rapist prince, who was of course Jonker van Makassar. And those connections become also very intriguing because Titus Jacobs and his wife are also witnesses to one of the prince's children. So we can integrate all these connections very easily, and they all hark back to Maria Hendriksz and to Pfeiffer, and and to Maria Hendrik's mother, Maria van Bengala. Now that's where it becomes interesting, because I know this is complicated. My head is spinning too, trust me. Not easy to unravel all of this. But they tie up again with the Vosloo's and all his bevy of slave beauties. And then, of course, the slave woman Tamara. And Tamara is so interesting because she gives birth to 2 twins, to twins who are black and white. And this becomes another interesting feature at the Cape. It's like, there's only 2 recorded instances of twins being born and of different color. Anyway, so Christina Helena, the sixth child of Tamara, we find her actually belonging to Jacob Hendriksz at some point, Jacobus or Jacob Hendriksz. So another fascinating connection. Now it gets more interesting because Jacobus, he's manumitted in 1712, probably or 1713, and he marries Van der Stel, Simon van der Stel's ex-slave, Christina van Canary. Canary is also, it's actually on the west coast of India, of the Indian subcontinent, and sometimes she's also referred to as coming from Coromandel, but that's more likely because of her husband, because he's from Coromandel. Anyway, she is freed by Simon, the old governor, and guess what? She becomes the owner of Stellenberg, the very famous opstal, Cape Dutch opstal at Kenilworth in Cape Town. Very beautifully preserved homestead, one of the finest that we still have. And it never gets mentioned when people regurgitate the history of this particular property. And it's thanks to Margaret Cairns and her research that we know now more about Christina van Canary. And there's also the connection to this farm was originally part of the also property of Jonker Frans van der Stel. Christina and her husband, okay, she dies in 1725. Her husband outlives her, and he divides the property, and he retains Vrygelate for himself. And this becomes another prestigious property that eventually becomes owned by some of the British officials at the Cape. So there you have it. And then, of course, you've got both Jacobus and Christiaan, both being top-ranking members of the Vrykorps. So they are in the military unit, and they act as, in a sense, the senior fathers of the free black community. And of course, they are instrumental in manumitting a number of slaves, which is quite phenomenal. They also inherit from other slaves when they die, so they get appointed as executors too. So yes, they were very civic-minded, very active in civic matters. Okay, I'm not going to say anything more about them. It's getting too complicated. What becomes interesting is Maria Hendrik's mother, Maria van Bengala. She marries very much later. And remember, there's the question of if you were a Heelslag imported slave, you couldn't marry a European. But Angela does. Katrijn van Malabar does. And she belonged to Van Guns. So those exceptions are curious. Why were they allowed to marry as Heelslag slaves, whereas Maria wasn't? And Maria's situation is also strange because after Van Riebeeck leaves, she gets put back into the company. And she is quite assertive because she demands her freedom, at some point, which she's entitled to after 40 years. And she basically says, you need to free me, and I want to be free. And they free her, of course. And then she marries a slave who belonged to Zacharias Wagenaar, who was the second commander of the Cape after Van Riebeeck. Isaac van Bengala they get legally wedded. And Isaac van Bengala dies without heirs. And there's a question into who should get the money and what about the wife. And she's remarried, and her second husband, Verkouter or Kouter, well-known Griekwa name nowadays, and same family. These people penetrate the interior, and they mixed race, and they are the movers and shakers of opening up the colonies and expanding the northern frontier. Very, very interesting. And they are wealthy. They accumulate wealth, which is, once again, very interesting. They But just also, Jacobus Hendriksz has other connections too, because I think he buys property in Wales Street. And Walstraat, of course, is the famous Walendorp, which becomes Kaap. And this is interesting too, because everyone thinks that Kaap was always an ex-slave property, or it was the first like real cluster of freed slaves. That only happened in the British period. And it's interesting that like Scots Kloof, which is part of Kaap, was owned by the Botma family, and she, one of the Botma, there were three brothers, and the youngest brother's wife, when she dies, she basically finances and gives Scots Kloof to one of her slaves that she frees. She frees another slave and gives him her farm out in the interior, which becomes Zonquasdrift, and a very crucial farm that was used to open up the colony. And she also, so, I suspect that people like Jacobus Hendriksz and Christiaan Wynandsz would have been working for people like her, Mrs. Botma, and their slaves, because there's so many connections that jump out at you when looking at the written record. Okay, so yeah, I've mentioned this already. Rosetta, his slave who marries into the Prince of Ternata's family, the Jonker family. Okay, so now it gets even more complicated, but this is, I just want to mention this as well. There's another key but seemingly disparate event, and there's a baptism in 1693, a joint baptism. Catharina van Bengale, who's Hester Mostard's slave, baptized at the Cape as an adult with Isaac van Bengale, who is, of course, Maria Hendriks's stepfather, and then the three Mauritian girls whose father was banished from Timor to Batavia, to Mauritius, to the Cape. And you have the three stammoeders, Wilhelmina van Mauritius, Hermina Karels, who's the stammoeder of the De Jager family, Catharina van Mauritius, my ancestor, who married Blom, the Blom stamfather, who was Swedish, and of course Maria Elizabeth Joosten, who becomes the stammoeder of the Erasmus family, Danish family. So I descend from two of those sisters. Now, why do I say I descend from them, and why do I feel the need to mention it? Because people don't realize how interconnected everything is. It's so amazing. It's like, who would have thought that one has all these connections? So the research is so rewarding. So here we have Catharina van Bengale. She's a neglected stammoeder, because it seems that she was baptized at a very late stage, and that probably in preparation for her manumission. But there's no evidence that I can find yet of her surviving after manumission as a free burgeress. There's no. She probably died at some point and didn't quite enjoy her freedom. But what becomes interesting is that she also had numerous owners. And just quickly, here are all the people that owned her: Jacob Dus, Gilles Nonnemans, Joachim Blank, Christina Dus, the Dominee de Voogd Adrianus, and Wouter Cornelis Mostert, and finally to his daughter Grisella, who was married to the fiscal Tobias Vlasvat. Now this is intriguing too, because Catharina had some very interesting children. One was Isabella, who was Heelslag. And special provision was made for her because her father belonged to the Dominee, and that was Abraham van Guinea, and her mother was Catharina van Bengale. So there was a dispute of ownership, in a sense, of who gets to, control the child out of this union. So the compromise is that she goes into the slave lodge and she gets her freedom, although she's Heelslag. So she gets early manumission, special provision, and she doesn't have to. And I think the reason too is that she has half white siblings. So this is a problem for the authorities. They don't quite know what to do with the Heelslag children who have siblings that are Halfslag, because the Halfslag have earlier manumission guaranteed and set out for them legally, and the others have to, have to serve a longer time, 40 years. So it's very interesting. If you research all the Heelslag children born at that time, you can see in each and every case, special provision gets made for them, like with Maria Everts, with Isabella, and with Marta Manuels, who's my ancestor. She was the daughter of Manuel from Angola and Katarina from Bengal, so she's half Angolan, half Indian, and her half sister, who's also my ancestor, and the stammeldoor of the Vermeulen family, was Halfslag. So the fact that she had Heelslag and Halfslag siblings meant that she had to be accommodated in as part of the family, but legally she didn't fit in so conveniently. But then you can see how they try to rearrange things to try and, get around the problem. Human beings are interesting, and law is interesting because law is, not cast in stone, but we believe it is for some weird reason. And, you know, we always have to find ways of getting around the legal impediments. So, you had the same thing with, I have a great grandmother who swallowed rat poison in London, in the east end of London. And of course, she was denied a burial because she'd committed suicide. And ultimately, they looked the other way and said, oh, she was insane. So that's why she took the rat poison. So insanity disqualifies full on suicide, so she can be buried in consecrated ground. And that's how they got them. It's very interesting that this kind of humanizing role in the law, as society evolves, becomes softer, kinder, and more flexible. And this is something I also wanted to stress in this talk, and that was, we forget the Reformation, where the Reformation took the power of the church away from the church and gave it to the state. And we are still living under that change. And you've got the idea that your status was determined by legitimacy and illegitimacy, and it trumps equality, or and also erodes your freedom somewhat. This has to be remembered. We don't really do enough research into the zeitgeist of the times, and who was writing what, and who was coming up with new ideas. And you know in the 1700s, and the late 1600s, the Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company, the French East India Company were very sophisticated institutions. And anyone who's really interested in that period, you need to read the writings of the movers and shakers of that time, like Sir Josiah Child, who was one of the directors of the English East India Company. And the same, if you read the correspondence of Batavia and Patria to the Cape, and the letters of reprimand, and of course the exchange of information between Batavia and the Netherlands and the Cape, in terms of how they were moving people and how they were trading and how their legal system operated. It's very important to get into their heads and to understand them. Because nowadays we just want to condemn, and we want victims, and we want, somehow we want a slave ancestor, and then we're happy. It's because it's so cool and so fashionable. These people were people, and I think they're so complex and so fascinating. So, I would just urge you to have an open mind and try and learn more about the times and understand the people in the context of the times. Now we get to Maria da Costa. This is Maria Hendrik's mother. I yeah, I'm not going to say much more about her. But I wanted to also mention there are, you'll see I've got a note there, testaments to adversity and resilience. Now, anyone using AI or chat GBT, whatever it's called, it's very easy to recognize some of those on Facebook nowadays, and it's highly irritating because everything's a testament to this and a testament to that and to the resilience of this person. So it's all being positivized somehow by AI. So be wary of this. If you see statements like testimony to, it's not real, it's artificial. Um, the it's becoming such a cliche now that somehow slaves were who succeeded. Like, you know, I'm seeing things like, oh, Jacobus, Hendriksz, and Christina van Canary owned this beautiful homestead at Kenilworth, and they were successful. So take that. You know, it's like a re-romanticization of slave individuals. But what's left out is that these were privileged slave individuals. They were not the rest of the slave population who were never allowed similar privileges and opportunities. Okay, so yes, this brought me to one article by an academic talking about forced dependency, or as I also call it with some irony, hereditas damnosa. So a damned inheritance, you know, and that's why I call this talk imposed freedom, because, you know, did these people negotiate their own freedom? I don't think so. And freedoms have been granted over time, and privileges and concessions. So, you know, we have to also bear in mind there was a time when there was a feudal system in Europe, and we still have remnants of that feudal system in terms of loyalty, fealty. Um, it's part of our work ethic, and the fact that the serfs, you know, also were slaves, right, in the Middle Ages. And that thinking and those ideas haven't just disappeared. They have evolved and changed, and in some cases, you know, they've become blurred. Very, very interesting. So the question of, you know, just to explain, hereditas damnosa, Latin term for an inheritance that is more of a burden than a benefit, causing loss to persons who inherit, because inheritance is, you know, is yeah, more of a problem than a solution. So the emancipation was not necessarily a good thing either, you know, because it created new responsibilities and it also created new privileges. And this is something I want to come back to as well. And that is, you know, one of the social development goals of the UN is to achieve equality. And then there's this talk of social justice. And somehow we are being pushed in a certain direction that everything has to be equalized. And this is deeply problematic. Equality and merit, this is the debate of our times. This is all about social justice. And, you know, I would go further and say that justice doesn't need to be qualified by an adjective like social. But to understand the evolution of human rights, you'll realize that initially, people thought of civic rights and political rights, never in terms of socioeconomic rights. So that's also a new evolution of human rights, and our views of equality are changing. And for the good or the worst, I don't know, but it's happening. So yes, finally, this brings me to the question of, if we're going to look at people like Jacobus, Hendriksz, and Christiaan Wynandsz, we have to ask ourselves, how did they? What's the secret to their success? And I've made a list of all of possibilities, not exhaustive. Adversity, resilience, robustness, dexterity, exposure, experience, agency, free will, individual choice, aspirations, emulation, greed, one-upmanship, competitiveness, personal motivation, adaptability, adoption, collaboration, servility. You know, being servile doesn't necessarily mean that you are still a slave in our modern parlance. And then self-actualization, Maslow's pyramid and all the rest of it, business acumen, orthodoxy, caste, voluntary assimilation, compliance, conformity, propinquity, privilege, patronage, assimilation, containment, incorporation, victimhood, resignation, talent, symbiosis, pragmatism, realism, loyalty, remnant fealty, obsequium, which was a Roman Dutch concept for you must be loyal to your previous owner. Those bonds must never be severed. Love, luck of the draw, historical happenstance, legally astuteness, the human condition, sheer merit. So we are inclined to want to ascribe intent to our historical persona, and we want to understand, but the danger is that we don't have enough information to be able to really know what motivated them. But there are hints, of course, and there is some evidence. But if we're going to piece it together, we should do it, a lot more informed, and not just, make assumptions without trying to find more evidence to substantiate what motivated these people. So yes, I think the question of, I get back to Christiaan Wynandsz and his clavichord. One wonders, was the man smug and happy and self-fulfilled when he bought that? Was it his way of just, telling the rest of Cape society, what they could do with themselves? One wonders, intriguing. I kind of like him for that. But that's it, right? That brings me to a final point, and that is, I was talking about the social goals and the equality globally. What I find fascinating about the modern world right now is that everyone thinks that equality is achievable. I don't think it is, because human beings have not changed. They are Homo sapiens sapiensis, and they haven't changed. Until they change, they're going to make the same mistakes. And one thing that human beings love to do is to, when you destroy a hierarchy, they just build another one. So now, like the corporate world, you've got new rich people who have replaced the old nobility of the past. It doesn't just disappear, and I think this is, for me, important for people like Christiaan Wynandsz and Jacobus Hendriksz too. They join that hierarchy, or they participate in it, or they are instrumental in starting new hierarchies. Fascinating. So if we're going to romanticize them, we should, just bear in mind that human beings are, if they get the chance to be one step ahead of someone else, they're going to do it, and nothing's going to stop them. So my question there, free Black community, were they vulnerable or were they a privileged group? There seem to be two conflicting interpretations by historians. And as I said before, they were a select few. Okay, and then I was just going to end on this note. Spinoza, remember, this is a Sephardic Jew, philosopher, and look at the sophistication of his observation about absolute freedom. The ultimate aim of government is not to rule or restrain by fear, nor to exact obedience, but contrariwise to free every man from fear, that he may live in all possible security. In other words, to strengthen his natural right to exist and work without injury or himself or others. No, the object of government is not to change men from rational beings into beasts or puppets, but to enable them to develop their minds and bodies in security and to employ their reason unshackled, neither showing hatred, anger, or deceit, nor watched with the eyes of jealousy and injustice. In fact, the true aim of government is liberty. Yeah, from his essay on that in a free state every man may think what he likes and say what he likes. And look at his time period, 1632 to 1677. This is the time of Jacobus, Hendriksz, and Christiaan Wynandsz. So please, context and getting into the minds of people that were contemporaries, very, very helpful. Right, thank you. That's all I have to say. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me.
So one of the questions that is interesting for me is the word opslag, which is obviously from a word means that it was somebody that was born into the slavery. But I mean, that word opslag is used quite frequently nowadays. My wife was brought up on a farm, and it was always great to get an opslag aardappel. Is that a similar word?
I'm not sure. I don't really know the term opslag. So what is it? How is it used though, in terms of?
Now you were talking about an opslag slave, or am I mispronouncing it?
Oh, sorry. I mean Halfslag and Heelslag.
Yeah, and opslag.
Ah, okay. No, I was talking about the distinction between Heelslag.
Yeah.
And so, you know, pure slave, no
Yes.
no mixing with any other
Yes.
Europeans, and then of course the Halfslag, which meant they were mixed race.
Yes.
And
Okay.
you would have had two kinds. You would have had the Métis, which is or Eurasian, or you would have had mulatto, Eurafrican. So that
Right.
combination.
Okay.
But also that's important to remember is that there were distinct categories of hybridity, which were also very technical. In the Spanish colonial system took it even, you made it even more complex. There were specific names for if you were 1/8 slave, 1/8. So if one of your great grandparents, so like my grandfather was 1/8 Khoi, and technically he in the American system, also North America, he would have been he would qualify as a non-white because he was 1/8 1/8 non-white.
Well, interesting. It's like getting your DNA result, and then you
Yeah, exactly.
you're 13.5% Ashkenazi Jew.
So, but as I say, you know, the 17th century was so complex. It was a very sophisticated time. It's the birth of the modern world. And, you know, I think if you look at a lot of research done in the past, more focus has been with David Hume and John Locke too, but even he hasn't been sufficiently looked at because he's from this period. But, you know, they were looking at the 18th century and doing the easy research. But when it comes to the 17th century and the 18th century, check with people. You'll see their knowledge of literature at that time is poor. Most people know about Daniel Defoe, but they've never read him, and they find him too difficult to read or too, you know, remote from modern thinking. But those are the people you should be reading if you want to get into the minds of the people at that time. You've got to read Jonathan Swift. You've got to read, you know, Jonathan Gulliver's Travels was seen as still is seen as a kid's book, and everyone reads abridged versions of it. No one reads about how Gulliver actually has to put out the palace is on fire, and the Lilliputians and the queen is outraged when Gulliver pulls out his chilogan and actually urinates on the palace and puts out the fire. And she doesn't even say thank you for him helping, and he's quite incensed by that, right? Because here I'm a gentle giant and I'm actually helping you. But here's this wonderful incident that has been purged from the original, and you know we give the book out as a children's book, as a fairy tale, and yet it's a highly complex political satire and a comment of the times. So yeah. You know, and what were people at the Cape reading? You know, look at the inventories. And that's why the reason why I chose the clavichord is I wanted people to suddenly realize, oh, they were playing music at the Cape, you know, and they were quite sophisticated. How did that happen? How many were there? And, and then when you start looking at how many clavichords existed in the existing records, not many. And you look at the books that were in the libraries and who owned books and who were mostly Philistines and didn't read at all. You get a very interesting overview of Cape colonial society.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I think I just got a comment to make. I think, Mansell, what you achieved today is made it known how complicated the lives were for the slaves. It is not just a slave or Halfslag or Heelslag. Okay, there was a lot of underlying politics and intrigues going on, and I just wonder, how did they cope? Now they were the rich ones, but now the less richer ones, the lesser known ones. How did they cope to?
I'm glad you mentioned this, because I didn't even get to that. But my class here from Angola gets her freedom, and she opts to go back into the slave lodge. And this has been a very puzzling question for me. Why does a freed slave woman who's a midwife opt to move back into the slave lodge and basically say, I don't want to be free. I don't want to be free. Why? Because some of her children, as company slaves, had absconded into the interior or onto return ships. Half of them remained in slavery. So, she was caught between a rock and a hard place. She didn't really know where to turn to, and she was old. So, do you stick with your enslaved family, or do you, opt out for freedom and buy a clavichord? So, the Armazine herself, same problem. She had half her family that was still enslaved and the other half that had got their freedom. And they got their freedom too, is because her son gets taken back to Europe by Willem Adrian van der Stel.
Yeah, I think it's a question of, it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. It must have been very difficult to adapt to a free life if you were enslaved.
It makes me think of, like Auschwitz. I mean, only now do we look at Auschwitz differently, thanks to movies like Schindler's List, where we realize that there were Jewish people that would have sold their own mothers not to go into the gas chambers. So those choices must have been very difficult in some instances. Like, do you stay in slavery? Do you accumulate the wealth, or do you suck up to your owner to buy your freedom, or buy the freedom of your children? And this is what we see with Armazine Klaas. She has to, she negotiates with the company to have her daughter sent to Europe as a free woman, and she never comes back.
Sure. Okay,
and that must have been very lonely, because you had to give up your family and sacrifice them to a better life, and that's what she did. But then she grew up 4 wolves, and how did she get to be so legal wise? And she had the support of some of the officials, no doubt. And of course, she slept with some of them too. So there's a lot to consider, So when you're looking at these people, all I'm saying is you really need to try and look at the bigger picture and the fuller picture. And it takes years and years of painstaking, how does it all come together? And no, ras my copy. I'm myself, I'm just thinking, this is too complicated.
Thank you. That was most interesting, Mansell. Just a point, you mentioned the return fleets. They were forced to sell their slaves at the Cape. Could you just expand on why they were not allowed to take them into Europe?
Okay. The thing is, when the Europeans went out in the Age of Discovery, and they happened on societies that were fully institutionalized in terms of slavery, and the Europeans had already abandoned slavery in the 1200s. There were remnants of it, but it was already understood that slavery could not be condoned. So they really had a problem once they traded with the East and with the New World, so-called, they suddenly, you know, slavery was back in fashion, and they had to participate in it, otherwise they couldn't trade. So there was a moral dilemma. The church, and as I say, we need to look at how the European thought evolves at that time. What were people thinking? And there was a serious issue with slavery, and their one way of dealing with it was to say, okay, we don't want slaves back in Europe because we don't want to regress. But we're happy to participate because that creates wealth for us. So yeah, it's so you had that's one of the reasons why the VOC had this rule, and they also didn't want too many of the inlanders in Batavia to actually go to Europe and to empty the colony at Batavia. They wanted to keep their people and retain them, and they also wanted to have a hybrid population which was seen to be more adaptable for building up the colony, for developing the colony. So there was the ban in the statutes of Batavia saying you can take your slaves to the Cape, and it's still a colony, and you can sell them there, but you certainly cannot take them back to Europe unless you manumit them.
Thank you. And my other
Mm.
question was, just to read what you said, it was so important. If you could expand on it again, please. You said
Sure.
enslaved, also enslaver, as opposed to slave. Reductionism at its worst. It's so important. Could you just go over that, please?
Well, that's just a note for myself, right? But certainly, I'm irked by this, this new term of enslaved, and it's being churned out by AI. It's being churned out by the pro-woke people who are just wanting to rename everything, and it's just problematic conceptually and semantically. And this is why I felt the need to mention it. I once asked one of the historians recently, like, what's your take on enslaved? And the response was very interesting. He said, if I don't use enslaved, I won't get published. Now that's disgusting. That's shocking. That's a complete, totalitarian control of freedom of speech and freedom of thought and action. So no, that is deeply worrying. Why are we being forced to use this term? And if social media is full of it. If now it's very fashionable to talk about enslaved, and people are even being castigated for using the word slave now. It's like, no, you can't do that. And we bloody well can. And I bloody well will. That's how I see it. I'm not going to be dictated to by anybody. And I have slave ancestors too. So, and they were slaves. Why must I pussyfoot around the concepts and pretend that, somehow their dignity has to be restored? And so restorative history is another problem too. What are we restoring? How can we restore if we haven't even done sufficient research? And those that want the restorative justice are not really doing any search of consequence, of substance.
I was just wondering if you've come across Wynandsz van Saxon, who married Johanna de Reyk.
Yes.
You say that some people, kind of now take on victim status because they've identified slaves. I found with Wynandsz on Family Search, and then it becomes kind of entrenched in everything else you look at. Somebody said he was from aristocratic descent or whatever, and the only things I can find is that he was a free black, and he seemed to have married a Heelslag. He comes into my family kind of via Besadenhout and Duisel.
Yes, okay.
Do you know anything more about him, or where I can find out more about him? I've also gone through his census records. He owned himself 2 slaves at one stage, kind of went up in the world. You can see from each opslag roll.
Thank you.
Right. So
can we do a thank you? Can we
So-
do a thank you?
Speak.
Okay, sorry, I muted them.
Okay, so Wynandsz van Zakse is a bit of an enigma. I think I have identified his paternity and his mother. I think he was definitely a company slave at some point. But you know, I've identified Johanna Dirxz, of course, because we know who we have her baptism now. But Wynandsz, there are two contenders for the Wynandsz, two baptisms for Wynandsz, and I think the one is more compelling than the other in terms of what evidence we have at the moment. But I'm hoping that we will find out more about him in future.
And the
He
chat,
also, what's quite interesting, sorry, what's quite interesting is going through the census. I presume the census guy kind of took the same route every single year, you know, because you see people marrying their neighbors and all that kind of thing. But there was a Wynandsz van Malabar who lived close by. Do you think he's a contender as a father?
Wynandsz and because he was Wynandsz and Leander are very different names. It's not implausible, but I'm not so likely either.
Not so sure. Yeah, no, it's just I keep on developing these hypotheses and then kind of
Sure,
going off
of
in
course.
some direction to see if it's possible.
But you'll see there were two slaves baptized Wynandsz, and they are contemporaries. And the question now is, you know, which one would he be? And I need to look at that again. But if you can find those two baptisms and do a bit of a cross section on them and see, you know, how they possibly connect or not.
Could be. Okay. Yeah, because when he got married, it said he was van Cabo.
But you must remember, of course, that
But it
Johanna
was late baptism.
Johanna Dirxz was the illegitimate daughter of Arend, I think, van Makassar. And
Yes.
these were all Simon van der Stel slaves. And of course, Klaas Malabar was also from the van der Stel household. So they were all propped up by the van der Stels. And that's why they get to have their farm and you know, get to play such an important role in the opening of the colony. And they become very interactive with the Griqua as well. You know, so very curious family, actually.
Okay, thank you so much. I can go down some new rabbit holes now.
Yes. Otherwise, just
Yes.
contact me and I will see what I have on them and I can share that with you.
Okay, through Facebook perhaps?
Facebook is fine. You know, just
Okay.
And otherwise, if you go to my blog, you can send me a message there, and
There
you'll
as
see
well.
I've written about Klaas Malabar and Johanna Dirxz there. And
Yes, I
think
was
I might
probably
even
that's
have
where I
some
got a
notes
lot better.
about Wynandsz. But
Okay.
he has been a bit elusive. But I'll tell you something else for nothing. Lawyer speaking. That I suspect that there's a connection too with the millers, and so the widow Heelms of Boshevel fame and all the rest of it, and who has the slaves, this Johanna van Amborn and Titus, she. I'm getting confused now. She what was I going to say? Sorry,
Widow van Heelms.
yeah. So the Heelms. Ach nee man, I've lost my train of thought. You see, it just gets me all excited. That's the problem. Just let me go back in my mind. What was I saying? Sorry.
Tell me for nothing.
Yeah, I said I'll tell you something for nothing about the connections. Oh, Miller. Widow Heelms marries Miller, Hendrik Miller, and he was, of course, he had the pacht, and he was very wealthy, and these are the same people. So the Heelms are the people that also adopt the Jonker prince and his children. But sorry, yeah, I'm trying to piece this together now suddenly. But I think there's there's a connection with the Millers, because he was from Van Zyl, and I think it's an alternative name for Miller, because Miller's such a common name, and or
Oh,
so
okay.
I would also go down that rabbit hole, because I think there could be a connection, and he might have belonged to that family as well, and that's how he gets his freedom. And then you need to ask yourself, what are the papers? Did they leave an estate? Did Widow Heems and her second husband, what surviving records are there for their estate? And also
Okay.
maybe go through the Schiepenkennis records to see if at any stage
No,
his
I've
manumission
done,
becomes available.
yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, right. Okay, I see what you mean. Because otherwise, the other references to Wynandsz was in a court case with Costa, who was drowned in Table Bay for sodomy. It was Wynandsz' horse and Marie's horse that he'd sodomized. So, he was definitely a Heelslag swart. But somebody went and put up a photo of a portrait of the Prince of Hessel van Kessel or something.
Oh,
and according to Family Search, he's now of incredible aristocratic importance. Thank you. I'm going to love going down there. Thank you so much for all of it.